Hello, my lovelies. Thank you for watching this video lesson, I guess I will call it. It's not so much a tutorial as a lesson. We are going to talk about humanism and its relation to the sonnet. We are in Unit 4, our Shakespearean sonnet unit, and it's going to be maybe a tiny bit difficult to figure out why are we talking about this when we're supposed to be talking about sonnets? But it's always important to discuss any art form, really. And since I teach literature, it's important to identify what's happening at the time, putting literature, a piece of literature, several pieces of literature in context. And that's why humanism is the first thing we're talking about in Unit 4, Shakespearean Sonnets. All right, like I said, we're studying Shakespearean Sonnets, Unit 4. I am going to limit this to under 15 minutes. If I don't finish this particular slideshow, if you will, I will just make another video because I think that if we try to bite off more than 15 minutes at a time, we just lose it, right? All right, so the sonnet is a form of poetry. It is poetry that exalts human love and praises the poet or speaker's beloved. So the poet is not always the speaker, but typically, you know how it is, there are exceptions, but typically the subject of a sonnet is praises for a beloved that the poet is writing about or the speaker is discussing in the sonnet, in the poem. The development of the sonnet is closely related to the rise of a philosophy known as humanism. So they do relate to one another. Humanism, during the time period that we're going to discuss, the sonnet came out of that particular time period. So the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. Dun, dun, dun. To understand humanism and the period during which humanism came about, you kind of need to know something about what happened before that. You know, what prompted this new cultural period? What brought this about? So we need to look at the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. And we did look at some things to do with this when we studied the Canterbury Tales in our last unit, but we're just going to go over some refreshers. So Francesco Petrarca, you might also hear him referred to just as Petrarch. He is one of the fathers of humanism. He also wrote lots of sonnets. He coined the term Dark Ages to describe this period that lasted from the fall of Rome in 476 AD until about 1000. Some people argue about what that time period actually is, but just kind of, this is a loosey-goosey reference, about 476 until about 1000. During this time, much of the knowledge was of the classical age, when ancient Greece and Rome thrived. And during this time, a lot of that knowledge was lost. We don't even need to go into why it was lost. Maybe you can go down that rabbit hole by yourself. Western Europe's culture declined so sharply that historical records from the Dark Ages are really hard to find compared to earlier eras. The Dark Ages gave way to the Middle Ages, which lasted until the 14th century, and then we see a rebound in European culture. During the Middle Ages, towns grew in size, economies developed, trade improved, political stability increased. I believe even the average age, life expectancy increased. So what about the Italian Renaissance? Apparently the picture I put in here isn't going to pop up right now. Oh well. So the Italian Renaissance and humanism, how are they connected? Well, the Middle Ages gave way to a period called the Renaissance, which began in Italy around the start of the 14th century. And if you recall, when we were reading Canterbury Tales, that's about when the Canterbury Tales was written and published. So Renaissance means rebirth, and this period's name reflects people's renewed interest in the culture of the classical age, the period during which ancient Greece and Rome thrived. Art, architecture, philosophy, literature flourished during the Renaissance, and one of the most important philosophies of the era was humanism. So, how did this start? How did this humanism start? Well, Renaissance humanism developed first in northern Italy around the year 1350. And at this time, the major centers of culture and learning in this region were cities like Florence, Milan, Venice, Venice, if you speak Italian. And if you recall Italy being the boot, right? It kind of looks like a boot. These three cities would be in the northern part of that boot. In the later 1300s and throughout the 1400s, the influence of humanism grew and it spread, as these ideas typically do, in the world. And so it left Italy and went into greater parts of Europe. I thought I would just do a very small little grammar lesson here. I see a lot of people make this mistake, adults as well as kids, but when you are referring to a decade, like a decade or a century or centuries, no apostrophe. So 1300s, no apostrophe between the 0 and the S, and same with 1400s, right? So you do want to write the 1950s, no apostrophe, or the 50s, where you don't have to do this, but a lot of people do put the apostrophe in place of the 19. Do not write 1950 apostrophe S or the 50 apostrophe S. No, 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 because we're too smart for that. We do it correctly, right? So very small little offhand grammar lesson there. So Middle Ages versus the Renaissance. If you recall, in our Canterbury Tales unit, we talked about this feudal structure, right? Where people did the work assigned to them so that it benefited the whole community. Well, that's ideally how it was supposed to work, right? So the peasants worked the land around a castle. In return, they got protection from the lords and knights. And, supposedly everybody works together for the benefit of the community. So the Middle Ages considered people, human beings, corrupt and imperfect. And the world was just this veil of tears, and we were just supposed to endure life until heaven was attained. We only lived here for a short amount of time, the whole purpose of which was to get to heaven. And these beliefs helped people make sense of life. That's true of a lot of things. A lot of myths are born out of, and creation stories and things are made out of trying to make sense of the world we live in. And in this case, it made sense or helped make sense of illness, short life expectancies, right? Injuries, early mortality. Why was life so short? I mean, the average life expectancy, I believe, in the Middle Ages was like 30. So the hope that heavenly rewards would pay for the labor endured on earth, it comforted people. And we cope the best we can, right? Even now, if we're trying to cope with something, we need explanations. So if you were locked into this lower level where you were a peasant and you were toiling away in this feudal society, you set your sights on heaven and trying to attain entrance into heaven. So there's the Renaissance and humanism. How do these relate? Hopefully this, I don't know, for me, I like images. And I remember this image. I'm like, I've seen this image. I've seen this image lots of times. You may or may not know that Leonardo da Vinci was the artist, and it's called The Vitruvian Man from 1492. But this very much points to humanism. So humanism championed the human and the human's potential and how perfect the human form was and and how perfect the mind was, um, and how knowledge could make everyone a better person. And it celebrated this idea of self-expression and being curious about things. And it did away with these old rules, which repressed people. And if you didn't adhere to the rules, life was a mess. So the rewards of life for humanists were as much in this world as they were in heaven for the period of the Middle Ages. So it was okay to live life to the fullest in this world. So the advent of humanism elevated the individual, and it marked a shift in political thought. In the Middle Ages, individuals served the state. In the Renaissance, the idea arose that the state should serve individuals. And I put a little note here. Which one would you prefer? I guess it would kind of depend on where you were in that feudalism hierarchy, right? So Renaissance humanists urge people to study, emulate, and build on what already existed from the Greeks and Romans, the ancient Greeks and Romans, the poetry of Greeks and Romans, the art forms, the architecture, the the political teachings, the education of Plato and um, Socrates and some of these ancient Greeks and Romans. It's like they were going to go back to that kind of thinking. You may also recognize this image from Michelangelo's work in the Vatican Sistine Chapel. It depicts Adam receiving the divine spark of life from God. And Renaissance artists celebrated the beauty of the human form. This is artful, right? This isn't nudity, this is artful, and the human body is beautiful. And the human form is the apex of creation. It's the first thing God touched. And we are going to come back and I'm going to make a second part to this video.